Thanks, everyone. Nice to have you with us today, and welcome to our final webinar, the fourth in the AOD Service Provider Conference Series. My name is Scott Drummond, and I'm the Program Manager at VADA, filling in for Sam this morning. I'm sorry we're not together in person. The Service Provider Conference is an opportunity I hope and expect many of you look forward to catch up with sector colleagues, have some lunch together, and enjoy a range of informative presentations. We certainly have the informative presentations bit, but we're not meeting in person, unfortunately. And there always seems to be a particularly nice feel, I think, to the November conference on the cusp of summer and Christmas, but next year, we hope. Before we begin, may I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we are all on. First Nations people have occupied and cared for this continent for over 65,000 years. I would like to pay my respects, and ours, if I may too, to Aboriginal elders past, present, emerging, and Aboriginal people with us today who own, belong, and share in that amazing history. Always was and always will be. The topic for today is childhood trauma, alcohol, and other drugs and treatment. Our host or MC for today, who will introduce our speakers and guide the conference, is Julia Daly, one of VADA's newest staff members, and it is my pleasure to introduce Julia, in fact. With a business management background, Julia has worked in both corporate and AOD sectors. Prior to her time at VADA, she held various roles in Students for Sensible Drug Policy with a focus on administrative, project management and operations management. Her previous AOD experience has specialised in youth representation and treatment within the sector. This combination of AOD and business backgrounds has her providing support across VADA projects, events, network meetings, and of course, hosting service provider conferences. Thanks, Julia. Thanks, everyone. Nice to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Scott. So as Scott identified, this webinar includes a background into childhood trauma and its potential impacts across a lifetime. It'll include practical tools and tips for dealing with clients that have experienced trauma, and we'll conclude with an audience Q&A opportunity. Our first presenter today is Tara Schultz with a beautiful consumer perspective. Tara first knocked on the door of a youth support service office as a young person seeking to address many of the issues sadly all too common for people in her demographic. Struggling with substance abuse, homelessness, and many forms of trauma, she developed a close working relationship with services from that point on. Service provision has been a point of focus in her life, not just in supporting her way forward in the world, but also in walking alongside them to address the many issues of disadvantaged young people like herself. Having grown up experiencing firsthand the health and social impacts of marginalization and disadvantage, she completed her university degree and works to integrate academia, politics, and lived experience to help decipher the language barrier between very different worlds. Tara is politically active and works as a consultant, speaker, and freelance writer. Her published works are aimed at raising the often unheard stories of disadvantaged groups into the public discourse. It is my pleasure to introduce to everyone Tara Schultz.
Thanks for that. It's good to be here, and I really appreciate being invited to these things. It's always a pleasure to be able to share my story so that hopefully we can generate a bit of a better understanding and, again, I guess, break down that language barrier. So to talk about a little bit about the world that I grew up in, it was constantly shifting, and I could never get my footing or find my moral compass or even understand the solid lines between me and the world. I remember as a child, I would often examine myself, trying to see those lines like a cartoon character, where I ended and the world began. It was a childhood fancy, but reflective of the damaged boundaries I was developing for the sovereignty of my own body. And my mind and my identity became increasingly blurred in this shifting society, the constantly changing world and the fleeting values, norms, and stability. The society I grew up in never stayed static. It was full of ever constant new threats I would have to navigate, submit to, or assimilate into. And even now, I wonder if who I am is not just another attempt to assimilate into a broader threat, the need to be accepted by my society for the safety it might provide. It's safe to say that I struggled. Who we are and our identities are often formed in relationship to those around us. We say, who am I in relation to you? We perform our identities either as women, mothers, or teachers, doctors, or parents. Our identities are made up of a lot of differentials that define us and our relationship to each other. Who I was in relation to the world around me as I grew up was often the bad kid, the awkward kid. Labels such as sibling or even offspring or the child of a parent were blurred and distorted. Soon I came to reject the other forms of identity. Student, female, the relationship I had to the society around me became fragmented by repeated violations. As such, the boundaries we form through the connections we have with the world become eroded. And as a counsellor later told me, I was like a house with no front fence, and people would walk across my lawn as there was nothing to suggest that it was prohibited. I grew up in a family unit that didn't quite know what it was. It struggled with identity as a family unit. My mother had severe schizophrenia, and she struggled a lot with looking after me and my brother. She soon came to harm us, and by the age of 4, my father had got custody of us, and my mother later ended up in permanent care. Though my father took on the role of main caregiver to protect us, he himself struggled immensely with isolation from the world. When he was a young man, his brother died in a motorcycle accident, and he was the driver. It formed a great rift between him and his family, and he became quite isolated himself. He became withdrawn and started selling cannabis to reduce the financial impact that his dependency on that drug was taking. However, this led to constant police raids and constant moves. We lived in several different towns and more houses before the age of 10 than I can count. And no matter where we went, there were more predatory men who would prey on me and my brother. My father was often distant and depressed and unaware what was happening. Trauma is often something that's passed down between family members in a variety of ways. And just as my father didn't fit into society and was on the wrong end of the law, my brother and I didn't fit into school. We were the new kids. We were the problem kids. We didn't fit in and we couldn't form connections or relationships for that matter. And further, we rebelled against a society that rejected us. Who we were in relation to the world was deviant, bad, and poor was often interpreted as a moral failing, as a choice. We were almost what society measured its identity against. We were what was wrong. We were the criminals and the deviants. We were the outsiders and the others. I was suspended 12 times and expelled. Society often took a punitive approach to what was really a manifestation of trauma, ADHD-like symptoms, being unable to focus in class, being unable to understand when it was appropriate to speak or what to say. It was a lonely world, and I was a very lonely child. And a lonely child must navigate boundaries that had never been set. My mother often trespassed those boundaries in our relationship when she did have custody, and my father was distant and struggled with appropriate parenting skills. So just as markers of class can be identified in the way people dress, such as things such as brand name clothes or unwashed clothes full of holes, so too can markers of trauma be perceived by not just institutions, but those on the lookout for kids who might have insecure boundaries. Those kids who have a lived experience of trauma, and that can lead to further abuse or bullying. I was targeted by over 13 predatory people by the time I was 12. And some were just random men in parks of no known relationship to me. One was a man that happened to be at the fish and chip shop that I was at. Some were older kids at school, and some were kids my own age. And many were friends of my father's and my mother's. When that many people target you, you cannot help but blame yourself, because you're the only constant factor. You're the only known consistent thing. So you feel like it must be something wrong with you, because other kids must have said no. Other kids must have been able to have healthier boundaries and a way of asserting themselves so that they weren't being targeted. So therefore, it must have been my fault that I was being targeted by so many people. It's hard work overcoming trauma, and multiple traumas compound each other like cascading failures in a plane crash. What starts with one, the police violently entering your home as a child with unstable parenting, leads to anxiety, which leads to withdrawal, which leads to boundary violations, and then compounds itself further because you haven't had the chance to develop in the way that perhaps the well-protected, assimilated child has. So from childhood, I had anxiety and I would perform almost ritualistic compulsive acts. Perhaps they could even be seen as grounding activities, in the sense that I would often outline traces, I would trace the outlines of objects with my fingers, or count in threes, anything to just help keep the anxiety at bay. Or perhaps I would touch a post just to see if that might change something, just to see what control I had in a world that was so chaotic. But it wasn't enough. And my drug use soon began at 12, alongside or shortly after the self-harm began. So complex trauma is hard to work with, and it's not just one single event, but much like the knotted cables at the back of a television or a cluster of necklaces. One knot soon leads to another, which tangles into another, and you don't quite know which knot led to what and where it all began. So those knots then become anxiety, shame, and depression, which soon feel overwhelming. And it's hard for a child to know how to deal with those strong emotions. It's hard for a child to even know how to deal with regular emotions. So drug use provides a mechanism in which you can detach from your emotions in a way that kind of enables you to stand at a distance from a lot of these situations. It can help you potentially try to analyze those things that have caused you immense suffering in your life. And sometimes you feel like you're processing them, or sometimes it just simply masks them. I struggled with self-regulation and tolerating distress. It has taken all my lifetime to learn how to manage this. Those knots that were formed at the back of a television are things like self-harm and drug use and risky behavior. I use these tools to protect myself from the emotional turmoil and the disconnection from society. I tried to live some sort of life for myself to deal with the resentment that I had towards society. I thought I was helping myself. I wasn't always trying to be self-destructive necessarily, though sometimes that might have been the case when it came to shame. But generally, I was trying to calm the wounds that had led to such turmoil in my brain. Much like we might give up on those tangled cords and just do our best to hide them and hope that it all just kind of continues to work somehow. I was lonely and I had no help to make sense of the events of my life, only the realization that I wasn't like everyone else and that somehow I wasn't able to live the same life that other people were living. So my boundaries and connections were eroded, and I like to think back and wonder what it might have been like for me had somebody helped me establish those boundaries or seen me as having worse and thus been on the same level as those in society. Lack of boundaries growing up presented in numerous ways, allowing people to take as much as they wanted from me, giving as much as I could just for the sake of giving, or giving away possessions, or putting myself out or in uncomfortable positions. It meant that I struggled to understand values and how to hold on to them. Were they malleable? What set them? Why did I believe them? I was lucky enough to have numerous books full of heroines that I could admire, and I believe this helped foster some of my resilience. But throughout my life, I was witness to a wide range of violence perpetrated against us by police, against my father by police, and my father against us, against by other kids as well, and witnessing domestic violence and family violence in the families that were a part of the underclass, the class that's locked out of the economy and legitimate society, often due to mental health, criminal records, or disability. It's hard work in a desolate world, a world that you must always remain vigilant in. And without the tools to understand why you are in these positions, self-blame sets in. Did I invite this trauma? Was my family in the wrong for selling cannabis and leading to the police violence? Was I in the wrong for allowing the abuse, or even feeling like I'd encouraged it? This shame further drove a wedge between myself and anyone that might try and come in to help untangle the trauma of my life. For how could I believe what they said about me? What they said was my potential, or the nice things service providers might have said about my character, when they didn't know the crimes that I had committed, the behavior I felt I encouraged. I felt dirty and wrong, and that separation soon became more intensified. As I got older, it was like trying to understand what somebody was saying underwater. Their voices were muffled and I couldn't process it. How could I possibly ever recover when the resources of greater society and my community were so adrift and so jarred and so far from me? So shame is a large factor in not being able to fully disclose. I blamed myself for the acts of depravity and violence, and soon I became open to more exploitation. My identity became blurred, and I didn't even know which way my moral compass even pointed. For if I were to blame for these acts, then I must be as bad as these acts themselves were. I thought that perhaps that's what I deserved and where I belong. And so I also stole, and I lied, and I cheated. I resigned myself and submitted to the exploitation of men who said they would protect me. I then only welcomed the praise from these men who exploited me, who also lingered on the outside of society, who knew how dirty and wrong and bad that I was. I thought I had control, and by the time I was 8, I'd learned that you could blackmail predators. When they offered you bribes, you could sometimes flip it so that they paid for your silence without having to give them what they wanted, without having to be traumatized. However, these negotiations were not for a world for a child. Eventually, by the age of 12, a man groomed me into believing that he loved me. He promised me a house with a white picket fence, a dream for me of serenity and normality, a home and a caregiver who would care for me and attend to me. He exploited my need for a parent in the most heinous way. My father and my only caregiver at the time really struggled to parent me. As I abused alcohol, my behavior became more and more unpredictable. So my dad had left home by the time I was aged 14, and I was left with that man who was twice my age. And that man then kept me until I was 20. Sometimes for people like my dad, it's hard to know how to parent teenagers with such severe behavioral issues. We'd never seen a specialist in our life. It was funny for me talking with some friends of mine who would say that they were taken to a specialist, or that their parent had took them to a psychologist or another specialist. I think I only ever saw the dentist once. I never saw a specialist in my life. So Dad just really lacked any knowledge or skills on how to deal with such complex issues that his kids faced. And soon he left, because living on the outskirts of society, people don't engage in the same institutions that everyone else does, and they don't have the same tools. So he left me with his girlfriend, and I was living in the care of the man who was abusing me. And Dad didn't know that that abuse was occurring at the time. The abuse and the horror that that man put me through was just a fact of life for me. It felt normal for someone like that to do that to me. And it was better the devil that I knew than the ones out there that might do worse. And that was the life I felt that I deserved. Through all of this, I did not even know that I was traumatized. I didn't even give myself that validation that I'd experienced trauma. This was just life for me and the decisions I had made. This was shame, and I didn't deserve that compassion that an understanding of trauma might bring me. Those lack of boundaries combined with the loneliness and a life that had perhaps normalized for me, it normalized that older men found you attractive as a child. I walked a tightrope with a prison of abuse on one side and the relief of death on the other. And my only escape and the only way I had to make sure I could stay alive through all this was to use substances. The predator was a dealer and he kept me supplied. Although I went to youth detox, I believed many times, believing that if I could end my dependency on the drugs he was supplying me, perhaps I could leave him. And Fitzroy Resi was an oasis for me. The connections with the workers were my first positive relationships with adults, though I couldn't understand my trauma nor really believe them when they told I could do better in my life. It was a first real taste of a stable home life. But it was only 2 weeks, and giving up the drugs didn't help me break free of that abuser who had a tight hold of me. I had no home and no secure attachments and a life filled with trauma. No matter what drug I kicked or what hostel placement I got, I always ended up going back to that man because I had no home and no secure attachments and a life filled with trauma. No matter what drug I kicked or where I went, I always went back to him. It wasn't until I was 20 that I found somebody else to cling to and forged a new relationship that I could feel safe. So taking away drugs also risks taking away the only coping mechanism that I had. At one point, I ended up with 16 stitches in my arm. So you can't pull a rug from underneath someone without having something to cushion our fall on. A lifetime of trauma and of shame and of breaking you down, of that self-blame breaking you down, will require a lifetime of support building you back up, often delivered in the space of a matter of weeks or months, or when you can get into service provision, or potentially years with a good worker. So I was unable to understand the multiple ways that trauma affected me. As I said, I didn't even know that I was traumatized. So I opted not to go to rehab. I only went to Fitzroy Resi for the 2 weeks, and I didn't think that I was bad enough to go to rehab, not in the sense that I was cocky, but in the sense that I didn't want to take the place of somebody else who might deserve it more or might need it more. I even felt like an imposter in the detox itself. I remember going to YSAS and I felt kind of abashed that I was there for only cannabis use at the time, even though I dabbled with methamphetamine. And even though I was coming from this really horrific, traumatized place, I felt like an imposter. And it's really hard because you feel like an imposter no matter where you go, whether it's school or work, or if it's a service, you feel like you're taking away the space that somebody else might deserve more. So I'm often referred to as a survivor, but surviving doesn't mean it's over. It means you have to push up. Means you have to wake up every day to push a boulder up that hill, like Sisyphus, forever pushing the boulder up and you must wake up every day and do it every day just the same. So I needed to feel seen, and through learning what other girls like me went through by the age of 27, that's when I realized I wasn't alone. And that's when I realized that perhaps it wasn't my fault. I felt both comforted and infuriated. Comforted in knowing that I wasn't me and that perhaps this pattern wasn't a result of what I had done, but a result of perhaps systemic issues. And that's when I knew that I needed to take that man to court. And I needed to tell society what had happened to me. And in doing so, perhaps shed some light on what was happening to girls of my demographic and on what we needed to keep ourselves safe. And that sparked a lot of things for me. And I think that's when I started doing a lot of these presentations and when I started eventually writing. So treatments for trauma come in very many different modalities now. And it wasn't until even my late 20s or 30s that I discovered that private health could open up more treatments than the public sector could in the adult system anyway. intensive DBT courses and schema therapy and EMDR. And I needed these when I went through the court case with that man. But they were behind this financial boundary that a lot of people from my demographic who face significant adversity don't have access to. So going to court, even if it is almost 10 years after the trauma, brings back that trauma like you're living it again. And so not knowing about any of the programs or services or understanding my trauma, it took a long time to recover from the court case itself. So eventually I went on to find the services that I needed. And through telling my story, I was able to develop a little bit more community and shed some of that self-blame and that stigma. And going to university and studying sociology also helped to connect those systemic dots with what had happened to me, and knowing that it wasn't my fault that these numerous people had targeted me, that it was issues of poverty and of marginalization and of exclusion, and that you're just more vulnerable to being targeted because people can identify that you have less power than other people. So I start my master's in social policy next year. I graduated in the top 15% of my human services degree because I always wanted to cure my mother of her illness. But now I see how much social issues and policy can make all the difference to ability for a person to cope, to find the treatments they need, to feel supported and not isolated. And I also write occasionally for the media such as ABC or SBS. And through this, I can potentially help broader society in some way understand who we are, the druggos, the deros, the addicts and the bludgers. Hopefully understand who else lives in this world, the marginalized, the forgotten ones. Trauma can come into your life in so many ways, and all you need is the right skills or the right people, or perhaps not all you need, but a good part of what you need is the right skills and the right people to help you manage, and perhaps that boulder we must push up the hill every day can become a little bit lighter. You don't recover from a life of adversity. You gain the right supports to deal with the damage, and you become more reintegrated with community. Thanks so much for hearing my story today.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you so much, Tara. I have chills myself. I just want to say you are remarkable, and your ability to share your story and give it such a powerful and amazingly honest narrative is impressive and makes all of the difference in representing who you are. So with that being said, if everyone else is ready, let's move on to some practical tools and tips from Silvana Izzo, who is a trauma specialist and a mental health and well-being consultant. Silvana is a health and well-being practitioner and a somatic psychotherapist working in the field of complex and relational trauma in both clinical and community settings. She is trained in occupational therapy, family and systems therapy, and somatic experiencing, a body-based psychotherapy. She practices from a social justice framework informed by an intersectional understanding of identity and belonging, advocating for approaches that move beyond trauma-informed towards community-centered and healing-oriented models of care. Silvana remains passionate about relationships and self-reflection as foundations for learning. Thank you for coming, Silvana.
Thanks, Julia. Hello, everybody. And Tara, thanks so much for leading this webinar today. That was incredibly powerful, and I am incredibly humbled by your experience. So I'm just wanting to take share the screen. Here we go. So that's me. I just really want to recognise the traditional owners of the land on where I'm presenting today, the Bunurong and the Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, recognising the connection to land, country, community, story, spirit for thousands of years. And I thought maybe everyone could have just a little tiny bit of movement. Tara's story was incredibly powerful, and sometimes intensity of emotion can really fill our system. So a little bit of movement and connection to ourselves is something to think about. And something that I was thinking about when Tara was sharing was, I'm about to, talk for the next 40 minutes or so regarding adverse childhood experiences and their impact on health and well-being across the lifespan. Tara's given us a really profound understanding of her experience. And something that I was thinking about when Tara was talking was, what happens when relationships, which is, relationships are our biological imperative. We're meant to bond and connect and be in relationship. That's how the human physiology survives. We need it for our psychological, our spiritual, our kind of biological survival. But what happens when relationships are both the source of harm and terror? How does the human spirit navigate that? We've heard a lot about kind of people using substances as a coping strategy, really broadly, or, you might hear people talking about using substances as a mechanism to self-regulate or to manage intense emotions. People can use substances for a variety of reasons. Trauma is incredibly complex. Like Tara was talking about, the incredibly tangled knot. People can use substances to feel. They can use substances to not feel. They can use substances to wake up. They can use substances to go to sleep, to speed up, to slow down, to connect, to disconnect. Substances provide many functions. What we're talking about, though, is bodies that are registering danger and overwhelm, even if the dangers have passed. Something I really want to communicate is that, and there is a lot of discussion around trauma-informed practice in health and human services, which is wonderful, needs to happen. However, we don't want to replace one pathologizing lens with another. So adverse experiences, there is always the possibility and the capability of something different between the stimulus and response. In the neural pathways, in relationships and in connections, exist possibilities. So trauma and traumatic stress is many different domains. These are some of the domains: developmental trauma, situational or episodic trauma, such as family violence, medical trauma, particularly in the early years, complex, intergenerational, ancestral, collective, and embodied cultural trauma, the kind of trauma that exists when people with marginalized identities are experiencing the oppression of systems and structures. These are many different domains. Today, however, we're going to really focus on adverse childhood experiences and how this might show up later in the adult cohort or populations that you might work with. So there's kind of 2 or 3 key concepts before we sort of unpack what are the adverse childhood experiences and what was the study. And 2 concepts actually I really want to kind of address is like, how do we know what we know? How do we know ourselves? How do we understand who we are and where we are, what our experience is? And so Paul MacLean developed this kind of conceptual model of what's called the triune brain. It's not a real thing, it's a conceptual model to understand how experience enters. And so there's 3 distinct languages. We have the experience enters from the downstairs brain. This is the reptilian or the instinctual survival brain. Experience comes up, bottom up. Then we come into our limbic brain or our midbrain. This is where we understand emotions. It's our social brain. This is where our feelings are. I feel emotions there. And then it progresses to the top, the thinking brain, language, words, concepts. So this is kind of, in a sense, 80% of our experience is coming up through our bodies, through our soma, through our physiology, leading up to our emotions and then into our, so I'm just moving my little picture out the way there. One sec. Okay, great. So a developmental approach. So when we're talking about bottom-up processing, we're talking about brainstem. experiences coming in through the brainstem, the limbic area, emotions, the neocortex, thoughts and feelings. So when we're talking about working with people who have experienced overwhelming life events, complex trauma, developmental trauma, attachment ruptures, what we're talking about is some really fundamental impact in lower brain structures. So there's the one thing to keep in mind is how experience enters bottom up. The other thing to keep in mind is the impact of traumatic stress. So stress happens in life. There's much stress. Positive stress, mild increase in heart rate, helps us get sorted. Mild stress to start the webinar, all good. Tolerable stress, maybe I've got something to get done. There's a lot of stress going on, but I've got some supportive relationships. I'm in a resourced community. I have enough kind of interconnections, and it's tolerable. Toxic stress is when there's prolonged activation of the stress response system within the absence of protective relationships. What I would add to that is also when we're in underserviced, under-resourced environments and communities. So the impact of traumatic stress, of unrelenting, overwhelming stress, is that we're experiencing it in lower brain structures. And so when we sense threat, we're sensing it through our bodies, through our soma, through our physiology. And this is happening in terms of the amygdala, which is kind of like in the center of the brain. There's two little almond-shaped organs, the amygdala, and better understood as the smoke detector. The amygdala is always on and is always kind of, I guess, scanning the perimeter to try and understand, are we safe or are we in danger? Each time a dose of stress comes in, the amygdala activates and it starts to send its kind of warning signal saying we're in danger, we need to do something. We need to either mobilize or immobilize, we need to respond to the danger. So that's a really healthy and necessary function. We need our amygdalas, we need it on and we need it working, scanning the perimeter to ensure that we're safe. The thing about ongoing, unrelenting stress is that we start to get habituated. We are starting to have that amygdala going off more and more and more. Each time the amygdala goes off, downstairs brain, the brain of sensations, is active. And upstairs brain, our thinking brain, our kind of big picture brain, our language brain, is less available. So what we sometimes understand is that people become downstairs dominant. It's got nothing to do with intellect. It's actually neurophysiological function that's beyond volition. Downstairs brain is the language of sensations, impressions, visuals, imprints, the feeling of something. And the more and more the amygdala sends a warning sign saying we're in danger, the more and more we become habituated to being in that kind of downstairs brain. What happens is that after a while, the smoke detector stays on. It stops signaling danger. It stops kind of making the distinction between safety and danger. And what we have is a smoke detector that's constantly signaling danger. And so then as a baseline, we are experiencing threat. So prolonged traumatic stress changes the way we experience the world. People in a state of fear and prolonged traumatic stress, they retrieve information from a world differently from those who feel calm. Security, the attachment bond, is one of the mechanisms that can mitigate trauma-induced terror. What happens when the smoke detector is on? Something like this is received like this. Same little cub, different internal experience. So understanding that we develop bottom up and also understanding the impact of trauma and traumatic stress on the neurophysiology, if we put those two things together, now we're understanding more deeply the impact of adverse experiences in the early years. Adverse childhood experiences Adverse childhood experiences is an epidemiological study, which we'll send links to in terms of the study. So Vincent Folletti and another researcher, epidemiologists, were actually exploring weight loss for a health insurance medical company in the States. And they were looking at what happened when people were actually on a program, reduced their weight, and then there was a bit of a rebound. And then they started to explore what were some of the kind of life and experiences and histories of the people in the study. And what they discovered was that they identified 10 adverse events in the early years in the domains of abuse, neglect, and what they talk about is household dysfunction, stress in the ecology of a person. So physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, mental illness, parental mental illness, an incarcerated parent, exposure to family violence, exposure to family substance abuse, divorce. These kinds of domains of adversity had an impact on health outcomes. And what they understood was that the more ACEs that a person experienced in their early years, there was an exponential increase in negative health outcomes. The kinds of outcomes affecting obviously behavior. So the more adversity, the more adverse childhood events in the early years, the more likely a person across their lifetime was going to have less physical activity, to smoke cigarettes, to have problematic substance use, to have periods of time of missed work, or actually not actually able to engage in the kind of workplace, with impacts, physical health impacts such as obesity, diabetes, depression, increased risk of suicide and suicidality, sexually transmitted diseases, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, osteoporosis, injuries. It's a large and can feel, in a sense, devastating in terms of the impact. Nadine Burke-Harris is an American pediatrician and the current Surgeon General of California. And we're not going to watch it today, but I suggest you hop online and watch her TED Talk regarding adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences we now have study are a health and well-being issue across the lifespan, and absolutely not a behavioural issue. And many of the things that Tara was talking about in terms of the way people might perceive someone, adverse childhood experiences require a public health response. So when we look at the adverse childhood experiences study, it starts here. This is an amended adverse childhood experiences pyramid where it actually also factors in historical trauma when we're looking at the experiences of First Nations, when we're looking at the impact of colonization, the impact of stolen generations, and also over here, adverse community experiences, as Tara was talking about, the impact of marginalization, the impact of being excluded from economic resources, impoverished communities, under-resourced and underserved communities. These are also traumatic stress experiences. So an amended adverse childhood experiences framework also situates the child and their family within the social context, within structures and systems. And for many that are living in adverse communities or experiencing intergenerational impacts of overwhelm, stress and trauma, there's an additional layer of adversity across the lifespan. So what we understand is that the prolonged activation of the stress response system in the absence of protective relationships and also resourced communities can evoke the experiences of traumatic stress. Traumatic stress can show up as echoes, as imprints, as impacts, as whispers, as sensations, as impressions. That's our body, our physiology talking to us and sharing our history in non-verbal ways. Many, many times, people cannot put into language their life experience. Tara's phenomenal. She can put a lot of language to her experience in incredibly evocative and devastating ways. Many people don't have the language for their life experience, and it's up to us as service providers to create sufficient safety for people to be seen in their experience. You know, Bessel van der Kolk talks about kind of trauma being the speechless, wordless terror. In those places of overwhelm, when we're downstairs dominant and we have that smoke detector kind of sirening through our system, the language faculties, the language centers of our brains are not available to us. We can't put into language what might be happening or has happened. So when ACEs are at the core of experience, we look towards non-language based ways. Now I'm just going to move through this. Yeah, there we go. We don't need the animations. So the polyvagal theory, which you might have heard about, is a great framework to apply to an understanding of adversity and overwhelming life events, to provide us as service providers, service developers, designers, to think in a more possibility and optimistic kind of model of practice. What we're looking at down here in the red zone is that a life of overwhelming traumatic stress puts that amygdala on sirening in overdrive, and people are either going to activate, fight and flight, mobilize, do something to kind of respond to threat, or people are going to shut down, immobilize, collapse to respond to threat. Either way, both of these are adaptations to overwhelm. They are not the core of who people are. Social engagement here, the green zone, that's who we are. That's who all people are. Attachment is a survival response, and we are built for social engagement. We require services and systems to be able to create the optimum conditions of safety and trust, co-regulation, in order for us to be able to connect or reconnect with our capacity for connection as our survival response. What happens as increasing danger is perceived is we tend to go more into the kind of fight, flight, and then immobilize. Our job as service providers is to support people to go the other way. Yeah. We want to be up here in the safety zone, in the social engagement system. And if people are starting to go into that downstairs survival response, fight and flight, or freeze, shut down, collapse, or fawn, become submissive, boundaryless, as Tara was talking about, she didn't know where she began, where she ended and the world began. When we're seeing people doing that, what they're signaling to us is that their system is not feeling safe. And rather than getting critical about their adaptive responses, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how can I bring in more safety? How can I create a more supportive environment? How can the program create the optimum conditions for people to be able to start to work up through their hierarchies and back into social systems and safety? So so when we're talking about the polyvagal theory, what we're talking about is over here, the safe zone, the social engagement zone. Social engagement is not all just chilling out. There's also activity in it. Social engagement, our social engagement system is here in our window of tolerance, safe levels of arousal. We are relaxed and ready. We can chill out in the hammock. We can sleep deep and have all of our cellular repair. And we can also be playful, excited, joyful, sexual arousal, activation with pleasure, activation without survival energy. So the window of tolerance is the optimum zone, and the window of tolerance is routinely the zone that's not available for people who have experienced overwhelming, unremitting adverse experiences and traumatic stress. There is always a window of tolerance, however, it may be very, very narrow, and people may spend a lot of time flipping between low arousal, checked out, zoned out, numb, or high arousal, combative, aggressive, anxious. And I say all of these words without judgment. We have a lot of pathologizing language in our system. I'm trying to describe a high and a low state. So you'll have all these slides. Deb Dana, if you want to know about the polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges, the researcher, complex. Deb Dana, a therapist who has actually been able to mobilize the knowledge into more user-friendly, more accessible content. Basically, what we're looking for, her kind of, I guess, visual is the autonomic nervous system is a ladder. When we feel safe, we can be up here at the top. When we're starting to feel danger, the siren is starting to go off. We're starting to feel like we're in trouble. Something bad might happen. There's something chaotic or unfriendly going on. We start to release adrenaline, cortisol, sympathetic activation. This is good. This is for us to mobilize to respond to danger. However, if our system, if the danger, the stress, the threat is unrelenting, or we have experienced inescapable attack, coercive power, the difference between a child and an adult, we might go down here into a collapse state, into a shutdown state. And then what we're called is dorsal vagal activation. It's the most primitive part of our physiology, is keeping us alive by making us numb, is keeping us alive by shutting everything down. It's keeping us alive by dropping our blood pressure, dropping our awareness, and actually releasing a whole lot of endorphins. This is a dissociation. This is a disconnection. So this is the shutting down place. This is the bottom of the ladder. This is the dorsal vagal physiology, the most primitive part of our autonomic nervous system. Over here, we're in sympathetic activation, demobilizing response, fight and flight. The thing that we can understand between both places, the shutting down and the blowing up, is what's absent to us is that thinking brain, the top brain, the neocortex, the part that uses language, the part that beds down memories, the part that has big picture thinking. It's where we access our empathy, our big picture awareness, our sense of connection. Those things are not available to us. Those experiences are available here in the window of tolerance, our just right zone. It's our optimal problem-solving zone. Often we're working with clients and they might be here in the numb shutdown zone or over here in the high arousal, mobilizing. In the high arousal mobilizing, people's bodies are getting away from danger. They're on the move. Down here, people's bodies are getting away from terror by staying super still. And sometimes we're trying to engage here about problem solving, about reasons for use, about strategies, about brief interventions. However, people are not able to take in the information. So what we need is actually to support people's physiologies, people's bodies, to come more into the just right zone so that there is more capacity to take in connection and to take in a sense of I can. The trauma vortex, when we start to work, traumatic stress slowly brings us into that downstairs brain. And in that downstairs brain, there are somatic maps. And the somatic maps are maps of overwhelm, of disconnection, of I can't, of I don't exist. People's systems can be stuck on constantly in high arousal, or they can be stuck off, numb to the world. There's isolation, fragmentation, intense emotions, feeling separate to the world, and not existing, finding it hard to feel your edges. There can be the tidal wave. So when we experience adversity and overwhelming life events, it's stored in our body in subcortical levels, and it shows up in patterns and behaviors, in sensations, in impressions. Trauma physiology is meant to be heard. It's that smoke detector signaling danger. It's stuck signaling danger. It's hijacked people's ability to be in the here and now and to be able to notice signals of safety and to differentiate between what's safe and what's dangerous. You know, the trauma physiology, the patterns in the body can reinforce stories and can keep people in a sense primed. It compresses time and choice. And it means that our bodies are constantly sending signals up through into our thinking brain saying, I'm in danger. There's something seriously wrong here. I'm not safe. There's threat. So when we think about that as trauma physiology, we can really understand a bit more clearly that the core concept in trauma-informed practice is establishing safety, relational safety, environmental safety, sensory safety, cultural safety. These are core fundamental skills. Everything else comes second, because we're working with people whose bodies are telling them that they're not safe. So, and the more that experience occurs, like ski tracks in the snow, it becomes in a sense irresistible. So you as a provider, you as an organization might be absolutely safe. However, someone might be coming to access services and their body is telling them that they're not safe. And humans will always respond to their internal messaging first. So we need to be working with people in a more embodied way so that bodies are signaling safety and can differentiate between danger and safety. You know, as humans, we have a negativity bias. Our bodies, our thoughts, our emotions, our experiences, we remember the overwhelming experiences. They Velcro on. You know, it's a bit like, and the good experiences, it's like the omelette sliding out of the pan. We need to remember the overwhelming, the traumatic, the intense adversities. In a sense, our physiology needs to remember them so that we get better at responding to them in the future. However, if life has had a lot of adversities, such as the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that's a lot of overwhelm being Velcroed on. I mean, Tara, you know, explained, shared with us profoundly some of the impacts of trauma in her life. You know, some of the things I think about is that experiences of adversity take you out of your senses. They take you out of your body. They take you out of engagement, out of connection. Ruptures relationships with yourself as well as your community, can shatter safety and trust, affects the ways in which we store and perceive information, and can create a real sense of incoherence, affecting concepts of time and space. And when I say stored at implicit levels, I say stored in the physiology, stored in our soma, stored in our bodies. However, it also can create experiences of healing and post-traumatic growth. So when we go back to the Before we were talking about how do we know what we know. Now we're talking about how can we use what we know. So resilience is not an individual thing. It requires relationships, not rugged individualism. One of the things that we can do as providers is turn down the shark music. And that means people's physiologies, their neuroception, their nervous system, detection of safety or threat. Often with adversity, the neuroception is danger. People's bodies are telling them they're in danger, even if they're in relative safety. So what we can do as providers is support people to turn down the shark music in their system. So what we're talking about is working bottom up, working here in the domain of co-regulation, working at that brainstem level, working on body regulation. And then we work up, we relate, we offer emotional regulation, and we do that through presence. We do that through back and forth, serve and return behaviors. We might throw a ball, we might just be speaking back and forth, we might be taking turns in something, we're using empathic language, we're mirroring, and we're offering relational safety. And then we're up here, reasoning, we're bringing language into the experience, we're offering opportunities to reflect and find meaning, we're offering perspective making, we're listening to story. And over here, we're offering cognitive regulation, a sense of coherence, being seen and being understood. Too often as service providers, we're up here in the reason. However, downstairs is dysregulated and unrelatable. We need to go bottom up, working from a resonance to presence to coherence. Now we hear a lot about triggers in trauma-informed practice, and in the interests of strengths orientation and not actually then ending up with a trauma-informed framework as another pathologizing lens oppressing lived experience, I like to talk about looking for glimmers, which are experiences, interactions, environments and resources that can help us feel safe and create possibilities for connection within ourselves, within others, with activities and environments and the community. So glimmers are those moments where connection is available. Glimmers are those moments where people feel more embodied. Boundaries start to appear. People start to materialize. The kind of echoing or glimmers of possibilities pass through people's systems. So glimmers are ways, they're the safe and social zone. Triggers, they're the activation zone. As practitioners and providers, rather than focusing on triggers, let's focus on the glimmers. Let's focus on the possibilities. Let's focus on the ways when people have a greater sense of connection. Some of the things as providers we can do in our own systems is allow time, think about readiness, space, choice, and connection. We want to lead with a right brain. That means connection. There's my old friend, electrician and attachment specialist with his grandson. Yeah? Being seen and understood and existing in the mind and heart of a loving, attuned and self-possessed other. That's what we all need. And this is what we can do as practitioners, as clinicians and as services, replace the attachment relationship, do some repair. So we do that through co-regulation. So we need to be a thermostat, not a thermometer. Rather than pointing out that client is dysregulated, instead, we use our system to help clients come back into regulation, whether they're coming up from disconnection or coming down from high arousal. And we do that through our own social engagement system. These are all the different parts of our ventral vagal nervous system. You can research it, activating these different parts of our physiology, which I'll unpack in a sec, activates our social engagement system. And we're looking for micro-regulation moments, those little present moments that don't have language, but they're those moments where people say, ah, you get me. Kind eyes, safe hands, easy voice. Turning down the shark music, noticing your own internal state. Prosody, the tone and modulation and flexibility in your voice. Kind eyes, side to side. Eye level. Have your sensory goggles on, see what else is going on, and move. Do as much of your work moving as possible. Move your body. Mindfulness and focusing skills. These are skills to bring into your practice. They're also skills for practitioners to manage their own arousal system. The more settled and aware you are of your own system, the more you can offer a regulated self to the therapeutic encounter. Spend time in nature. Connect with people who feel safe. Take time to rest. Engage in rituals and belonging. Ask for help. Look after each other. Riding the waves and finding flow, and into the flow and rhythm of life. These are all the skills that we just talked about. And the reason why is that in order to be able to work in the field of relational and interpersonal trauma, developmental trauma, adverse childhood experiences that we can see move across impacts across the life cycle, is that practitioners need to be here, understanding their internal state as well as the external state. So the more and more we can build body awareness, the more regulation we can offer to every therapeutic encounter. These are some little hacks when you're feeling overwhelmed as a practitioner, or you're wanting to just bring more regulation into your session. And these are also things you can share with the people you're working with. Hand on heart helps to down-regulate the stress response. Helps our system get easier. Feel your feet and grounding. That's connecting. A sense of embodiment, a sense of who you are. Follow your breath. I have sometimes young people say, if you give me any breathing exercises, I'm not coming back. So, manage them. Slow breathing is one of the only things that we can control in terms of the autonomic downstairs brain function that's happening at implicit levels when that smoke detector goes off. If we can slow our exhale, it sends a message to our system saying, well, we can't be in danger because we've got the time to slowly breathe. It's a really great way to reset the high arousal. Also look around slowly and orient to the here and now. Tara talked about tracing, looking around, looking at things that are pleasurable, looking close and far, naming objects in the room. These are ways of orienting back to the here and now. When trauma takes us out of time and space, orienting can help us come back to the moment and seek connection for yourselves and with your clients. So, trauma-informed, healing-oriented practice is all about the heartbeat. We're trying to match the beat of the universe. So, may your exhale be longer than your inhale. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Silvana. I hope everyone has very practical tools and takeaways from that presentation. And while I have you, are you okay with me sharing those slides with those who attended the webinar? Excellent.
Totally.
So for those who asked, those slides will be sent out after the webinar with a recording as well. So now to transition to a reflection on the challenges and opportunities that this consumer input and the tools and tips that Silvana provided might pose for service providers. And joining us today for that, we have Sharyn Smith. She's an alcohol and drug consultant with Barwon Child, Youth and Family. Sharyn works primarily with young people in residential care, out-of-home care, and high-risk complex clients. She also provides secondary consultation and support to carers and care teams around these young people. Prior to this role, Sharyn has worked as a youth AOD outreach worker, a residential carer, and has also worked within the prison system. Thank you for joining us, Sharyn.
Thank you. So I'd like to start off today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm meeting on today, which is the Wathaurong people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Just reflecting on, and firstly, thank you, Tara, for sharing such an amazing, powerful story. It's really helpful for us as practitioners to hear the consumer's perspective and the consumer's journey. Tara's story is so unique to Tara and her challenges, but unfortunately it's an all too common story of young people that I come across working in residential care and out-of-home care type placements. All these young people are so traumatized, and then they're put into a system that seems to control and possibly traumatize them even further. The challenges with youth AOD, I feel one of the hugest challenges is lack of funding, lack of time that we have to spend with these young people. The most important thing is the relationship that we can provide these young people, the safety, the security, and the consistency that we can give them. That may not be, we may not talk about their drug and alcohol use for weeks, but we just want to be there. We just want to be there and hear their stories. Being authentic too, I think, is really, really important when we're talking about young people, and just providing them with unconditional positive regard. We don't want to stigmatize these young people any further, saying things like addict and addicted. They're all so negative to these young people. They're so desperately trying to find some connection. They can't connect with adults around them or healthy peers. They'll connect with the substance. The substance sometimes is their best friend. The substance gives them, it never lets them down. It always makes them feel good. People don't use substances to feel bad. So I think, what are we going to give the young people to fill up that bucket or fill the hole that the substance is filling? We can't just take the substance away. Unfortunately, I think the system is so focused on getting these kids into rehab, into detox, without thinking, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to replace that with? And what does a young person want is the most important thing in my mind. Substance use is just a symptom, but what's the problem? The problem is all this compounding trauma. And how do we address that? I think we address it by just being there consistently, by listening, being present and listening to their stories and just hearing them, allowing them to display emotion, allowing or helping them find the skills to say, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm scared. But being there, regardless of what their, behavior, how their behavior may present. A lot of times we will walk into a residential care unit, a child, may be dysregulated, as we all say, breaking things, smashing things. So we're walking into a system where workers are traumatized, the children are traumatized, there's transference and counter-transference, and we need to manage that for ourselves as workers too, because some of those situations can be really quite scary and really quite traumatic for us. So how do we then model that behavior or that unconditional positive regard to that child to say, you know what, no matter how much you're lashing out, we will be there for you and we will allow you that space to express yourself. But how can we do it differently next time? Another couple of things that sort of popped up in my mind through the two previous brilliant presentations is, Tara referred to pushing the boulder up the hill, and that's a daily thing. And it's a daily thing that these young people are trying to move forward. They're trying to push their boulder along. Rather than telling them where to push it, let's just give them a little bit of a hand and help them push it, but push it where they want to push it, not where we as a society think that they should push it, or direct them where we think they should go. Let them, but we've taken enough power from them. Let them take their power back. Let them tell us what they want. Let's put the young people in the middle of their care. Let's allow them to dictate what drugs they want to get under control, what drugs they may want to continue to use. Of course, we educate them and make sure they're doing it safely or as safe as possible, but let's not judge them for it. We need to engage these kids on a long term, which requires funding. Most services are sort of hand-struck by that because we don't have enough funding, we don't have enough workers. Everything is measured in outcomes. The outcomes with these young people are not quick. It requires time. It requires a lot of time to build trust, a lot of time to build security for those young people to be able to tell their story. They may never be able to tell their story to us, but that's okay, as long as we give them a positive enough experience that when they're ready, they will feel safe enough to tell their story to someone, whether that be an AOD worker, a psychologist, or whoever it is. But we need to provide the opportunities for them to feel safe enough to tell their story so we can support them in what they want to do with their life. I think with regards to working with these kids that are really quite traumatized and dysregulated, I just like to take a really gentle approach and allow the young person to dictate what they want my level of engagement with them to be. If they don't want to engage with AOD services, that's fine. There's other ways that we can get that education to them to keep them safe with regards to their use. And that can be through their care teams, through their case managers, through their child protection workers. But I think ultimately trying to force a young person into treatment is not beneficial. The young person needs to have the power and the control over that system and their life, and to be given the opportunities for us to hear their voice, not take their voice away from them. Their rights and their voice has been taken away far too much. We need to allow them the space to take that back, take back their power, listen to them, and also be mindful of ourselves, be mindful of our own internal triggers, be mindful of how we're sitting with the young people, how we're listening. Are we really listening? Are we just trying to tick boxes, or are we actually just really comfortable and sitting and listening and being with them where they're at that point in time? And that way, I think we can start to sort of change the way that we look at treatment, and especially treatment with young people with AOD issues. It needs to be at their pace when they're ready. Hopefully we get some more funding, and there could be some more detox beds available, or more rehab beds available, or more opportunities for young people to actually just try out that system and try forming the relationships with other workers within the system. So when they're ready to cease their use, they will have those good positive experiences and good positive relationships, and know that that's a safe place to go. Like Tara stated, she had a terrific relationship with YSAS, and that is so important that we allow opportunity for young people to build those relationships, safe relationships with adults who can possibly assist them later on in life.
Thank you very much for that reflection, Sharyn. And now at this time, we are coming to the end of the webinar, but we have about 10 minutes left. So I'd like to welcome any audience who had any questions for any of the panelists, if you wanted to all turn your cameras on and come present. Feel free to ask it through the Q&A feature. I'll give a moment for those to come through. And otherwise, if there's no questions or comments, we'll probably lead to final closing comments. But I'll give everyone a quick moment. Well, we're waiting in case anyone has any burning questions or anything. I was kind of curious, Tara, if you wanted to provide kind of a little bit of a last couple minute reflection on everything now from your personal input into, I guess, what you see on this side of the service provider's point of view.
Yeah, it was really interesting listening to Silvana and Sharyn's presentations because it does really mirror a lot of how I inevitably found my feet in terms of learning how to regulate myself. When you grow up with a lot of people that struggle around you and you don't really understand how to regulate yourself, it's important to have those connections with workers. Like my worker, Warren, was amazing, and he never showed any kind of disappointment or, expressed any kind of despair or anything like that. When I would go back constantly to that man who was abusing me, he was just like, oh no, that's okay. Like, what do you need now? Which is kind of like what Sharyn was talking about as well. It's like meeting me where I was at. He wasn't like, you should be doing this or you should be doing that. And also those impacts of trauma are so pervasive. So, even though I'm doing well in many aspects of my life, I still have to struggle with things like fibromyalgia, which is a chronic inflammatory condition, causes a lot of pain and stuff like that. And then, little inflammation of various systems pop up, everything from rosacea to allergies to, it's amazing how much trauma can impact the body. So yeah, it was really good, informative presentation on both your parts, I think.
Excellent. Thank you for that reflection, Tara. We do have a raised hand in the audience from Esther. So I'm just going to turn on your microphone, Esther, if you're ready to ask the question.
Yeah, I've put it in the chat. My question is for the last speaker about the UTAOD. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, so my question is, there has been a lot of drugs in secondary school at the moment. So how can we get the secondary school kids to access UTAOD in the community? And did they go to schools to educate the secondary schools about AOD use?
Yeah, I guess.
How can we get them to get involved?
Sorry, Esther, I didn't mean to speak over you then. It would depend upon what area you are. You could contact Yoda or Direct Line, and generally there's a lot of resources actually on the Yoda website. There's a list for schools. It depends on what year you're talking about. It's really, and what area you are into, Esther. I'm in Geelong, so
Melbourne West. I'm in Melbourne West, and I work in Gippsland. So those two areas.
Wow, that's quite the distance to be traveling.
I know. Yeah.
Perhaps Googling Direct Line or Yoda's probably your best option to, I don't know whether I can put that in the chat box or something. There's a lot of resources in there for schools and for young people. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, I can't be more specific to your area.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll make my research. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking the question as well. So in the absence of any other questions, I think I'll go to final comments from, oh, nope, here's one. Nope, it's a comment, sorry. So I think we'll go to final comments from Silvana and Sharyn as well. So if you just wanted to take, let's say 2 minutes each and just give, a final takeaway or two of like, if there was one or two things that everyone could really take away from this webinar, what would it be? And Silvana, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I definitely don't want to be the last word in the webinar. I'd like Tara to be the last word in the webinar. I was thinking, Tara, when you were talking about Warren and how the non-judgmental, the impact of just being able to return and keep returning is the thing and I know Warren, he's kind, he's regulated, his system is safe. He is that relational attachment, he does the repair work, not necessarily consciously. And this is the thing that we can aspire to as practitioners. And like Sharyn was saying, I'd love a gazillion extra dollars in youth and across the spectrum in health and well-being. And in the absence of another gazillion dollars, we can, as service providers, as practitioners, really practice what does relational safety look like? What does it look like with a peer? What does it look like in leadership? And what does it look like in service provision? The more safe we can create systems and services internally, the more we're able to offer a platform for people to be able to connect with what is actually inherent in all of us, is life energy, life spirit, the capacity to be in the flow and the ebbs, thriving. This is within everybody's system, adverse experiences or not. But we need the safe container to be able to find that in ourselves, in relationship.
Thank you. And Sharyn, did you have any other closing comments?
I just agree with Silvana, and thank you once again, Tara, for an amazing presentation. It's the relationship. The relationship is so important, and being authentic and just being present. Sometimes that's all you need to do is just be present, and unconditional positive regard. Come back. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you did on the weekend. It doesn't matter who you sold drugs to or who you bought drugs off. I'm here for you as a person. I'm not looking at what you're using or how you're accessing your drugs or what crime you're committing. I want to know you as a person, you as a young person. I want to know your story, and I want to walk along with you. And perhaps I think as workers we need to share a little bit of ourselves. We don't want to overstep boundaries, but we need to be authentic in our care and our interest. I think the interest and really listening, not just listening for keywords where we can go, oh, okay, so you want to change your drug use. Let's pop you into detox. We want to listen to the story. We want to get to know the person. And we want to make that person aware that you can come back and see me as many times as you want. There is no limit. There is no wrong. You are not a bad kid. You're a good person. And, and the agency or the organization, we want to be there for you. And we want to help you be the best little person that you can be.
Thank you. And in for a final last word, Tara? Most importantly, I think the consumer perspective to finish.
I just think it was a really great presentation, and I always cherished how the workers would talk to me from their own genuine self. You could always sniff out as a consumer the ones that were kind of, I don't know, like perhaps going off something they've read, and they were just trying to like put some kind of box of understanding on you. Sometimes it's good to just take in all this information, let it sit in your brain, and then just be a human with you, because like I was so alone, and it's been really amazing interacting with services, not just as a young person, but now, I have community. And so even now, like that trauma hasn't gone away, but this connection that I have with community, with everyone watching, with you guys, it still is helping me, and hopefully other young people emerge into the same woven society, fabric that's kind of woven together. I think it's really important. So yeah, thanks so much.
Excellent. And we've reached the end of our time on our webinar. I did notice a question came in from Jody. Jody, could you email that question to vada@vada.org.au, and I'll see what I can do about getting one of the panelists or someone to get an answer to it. And beyond there, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today for our 4th and final webinar in the Service Providers Conference series. This webinar and all previous webinars were recorded and will be on the website and on YouTube if you'd like to view them. And lastly, I urge you to complete the post-webinar survey, as we're always looking for feedback as to your thoughts and appreciation of the webinar. Thank you very much to all of the panelists and the amazing stories and tools shared. And I hope you all enjoy your day.